Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to try to understand the rapidly shifting situation in Ukraine and how recent U.S. policy decisions are impacting the conflict, the peace talks, and really global alliances as a whole.
Yeah, and it really is an interesting set of sources that we have here this week. We've got whispers of shifting alliances, reports on the power of intelligence sharing, and some truly moving accounts of the human impact on the ground in Kyiv. So a lot to unpack.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm struck by, just glancing at the headlines, is how President Trump's move to halt intelligence sharing and military assistance to Ukraine
Mm.
has really thrown a wrench into things. Like, what are the consequences of that, especially for the people in Kyiv who are already living through so much?
I mean, just imagine for a moment, you're a civilian in Kyiv, right? You depend on those air raid alerts to tell you when to take cover, when to seek shelter, and a lot of that warning system relies on U.S. intelligence.
Yeah.
And now that flow of information is disrupted, that's got to be incredibly unsettling. At least people feeling incredibly vulnerable, not knowing when the next attack might come.
It's like suddenly being left in the dark in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. And then, zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger picture. This move also significantly impacts Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Without U.S. intelligence, their ability to target Russian forces and plan counterattacks is severely limited. It shifts the balance of power in a really significant way.
So it's not just about immediate safety, but their ability to fight back effectively. I'm seeing how one decision can have a ripple effect. But some of our sources suggest this might be part of a bigger strategy by the U.S. Like, they're trying to nudge Europe towards taking more responsibility for its own defense.
It's definitely a fascinating angle. I mean, if you look back at U.S. foreign policy, there's been this recurring theme of pushing Europe towards greater self-reliance when it comes to defense.
And now with budget constraints and all the political pressures back home, maybe the U.S. is sending a signal like, hey, it's time for Europe to step up.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. And it just adds another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. We're not just talking about a conflict between two nations, but really a shifting global landscape.
Okay, so from the battlefield to the negotiation table now, the White House is hinting at some optimism about renewed peace talks with Ukraine. What's your take on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of cautious hope, but also a lot of uncertainty. President Zelensky is in a really difficult position. He needs to secure aid for his country, but he's also got to navigate pressure from the U.S. and resist Russia's demands. It's a real tightrope walk.
Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Mhm.
But what kind of peace deal are we even talking about here?
So President Macron has suggested a temporary truce focused on halting attacks in the air, at sea, and on power plants. There's also been discussion of prisoner exchanges and bans on missile or drone attacks on civilian infrastructure. Zelensky himself has said he's open to discussing neutrality for Ukraine, but only if it comes with strong security guarantees.
I mean, those bans on attacks, that would be huge for the people of Kyiv.
Yeah,
But realistically, how feasible is all of this?
that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, Russia wants Ukraine to remain neutral outside of NATO, and they're not showing any signs of giving up the territory they've taken.
So even with a ceasefire, a lasting peace agreement seems pretty far off.
It's definitely not going to be easy. I mean, each side has its own set of goals, and those goals often clash.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting. As we have some sources speculating about President Trump's personal interest in Ukrainian resources and suggesting he's hesitant about direct U.S. military involvement. How does that factor into the equation?
Well, it adds a whole other dimension, doesn't it? I mean, if Trump is prioritizing U.S. economic interests and wants to avoid military entanglement, that's going to heavily influence his approach to this conflict and the pressure he puts on Zelensky.
So Ukraine's fate is tied not just to the actions of Russia, but also to internal U.S. politics and economics.
Exactly. And it highlights why we need to look beyond just the immediate conflict and consider the broader geopolitical context.
This deep dive is already feeling more like a maze than a straightforward path. But before we wander too far, let's shift gears and look at the reactions from around the world. What are our sources saying about how other nations are responding to all of this?
Well, the reactions are as diverse as the players involved. In the U.S., we're seeing some pretty stark contrasts. Democrats are outraged. They're accusing Trump of betraying Ukraine and maybe even breaking the law by halting aid.
That's a pretty strong accusation.
It is. They believe he's weakening Ukraine's defenses and giving Russia the upper hand. And then you have the Republicans, and it's not a unified front. Some are echoing those concerns, while others are backing Trump's strategy of pushing Europe towards greater self-reliance in defense. They argue the U.S. has carried an unfair burden for too long.
It's clearly a divisive issue even within the U.S. What about internationally?
Things get even more intricate there. There's a really fiery statement from the China's embassy criticizing U.S. trade actions, and you've got major car manufacturers who rely on those global supply chains sounding the alarm about a potential trade war. They're worried it could disrupt their operations and send costs skyrocketing.
So while the bombs are falling in Ukraine, the economic shockwaves are being felt globally.
Precisely. And these economic tensions add yet another layer of complexity to the geopolitical landscape.
It feels like everyone's playing a different game on the same board, and the rules are constantly changing.
That's a great way to put it. To really understand what's happening, we need to look beyond the surface and consider the motivations and strategies of every player involved.
This deep dive is definitely living up to its name. We've already uncovered so much, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. Stay tuned as we continue to explore this complex situation in part 2 of our deep dive. So we started to untangle this web of global politics and conflict, and we talked about the ripple effects of this situation and how everyone seems to have a different reaction. But let's get back to the heart of it all. Like, what would a realistic path towards peace even look like in all of this?
Yeah, it's the question on everyone's mind, but it's definitely not a simple answer. And remember, we're not just dealing with two sides here. The US, Russia, Ukraine, and even Europe all have their own agendas, their own priorities. Finding a solution that works for everyone, it's like trying to solve a really complicated puzzle.
It's like those strategy games where you have to manage multiple resources and factions all at once.
Exactly. And just like in those games, every single move has consequences. So let's look at some of the pieces on the board here. We have Macron's proposal for a temporary truce. On the surface, it seems like a decent starting point. A pause in the fighting could allow for everyone to kind of take a step back, cool off a little bit, give everyone a chance to breathe.
Especially for the people in Kiev. They're living under constant threat. A break from the airstrikes and the shelling would be a huge relief.
Mhm.
But would Russia even agree to this? I mean, they haven't exactly been known for peaceful diplomacy lately.
That's a really good point. Russia's ultimate goal is to see Ukraine as a neutral state outside of NATO's influence, and they've shown they're willing to use force to achieve that. So for them to even consider a truce, they'd need some pretty strong incentives.
Like, what kind of incentives are we talking about here? Would Ukraine have to give up territory or compromise on their relationship with the West?
Yeah, those are going to be major sticking points in any kind of negotiation. Russia might demand that Ukraine officially renounce its aspirations to join NATO and possibly even recognize the annexation of Crimea.
And would Zelensky be willing to do that? It seems like he's been pretty firm in his defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
He's definitely between a rock and a hard place. He has to balance the immediate needs of his people, who are suffering because of this conflict, with those long-term goals of preserving Ukraine's independence and their future. Agreeing to Russia's demands, it could be seen as a betrayal by his own people, but refusing to negotiate might prolong the fighting and lead to even more suffering.
It's that classic dilemma, choosing between the lesser of two evils.
Right.
But there's another layer to this. We talked about President Trump's possible interest in Ukrainian resources and how he doesn't want to get the U.S. military directly involved. How does that play into these peace talks?
Yeah, that's a crucial piece of this puzzle. If Trump's focus is mainly on American economic interests and avoiding a direct military confrontation with Russia, well, that limits how much he's willing to push Putin or give Zelensky his full support.
So Ukraine's fate is kind of tied to the internal politics and economic calculations of the U.S. It's not just about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to see this whole situation within a bigger context. We're not just dealing with a regional conflict here, but a global power struggle with really far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so we've got Russia pushing for a neutral Ukraine. Zelensky's stuck trying to navigate this impossible situation. And Trump's got his own game going on with U.S. interests in mind. Where does Europe even fit into all of this?
Europe, well, they're like the understudy who's suddenly been pushed onto the main stage. There's been talk of deploying what they're calling a reassurance force to try and deter future Russian aggression, but the details are still really vague.
Would that even work, though? Would a European force really be enough to deter Putin when he's already shown he's willing to break all the rules?
It's a big question. Some people think a strong European presence would send a clear message to Russia that any more aggression won't be tolerated. But then others worry that it could make things worse and maybe even trigger a much larger conflict.
And let's not forget the practical stuff. Would European countries actually be willing to commit troops and resources for a long time? And could they even work together effectively when they all have their own different interests and priorities?
All valid points. And it all comes down to this. Is Europe ready to step up and take on more responsibility for its own security, or will they keep relying on the U.S., which seems less and less interested in being the world's policeman?
It's starting to feel like one of those really high-stakes games of Risk. Everyone's fighting for control and trying to get the upper hand. But the stakes here are incredibly high, and the consequences of any misstep could be devastating. It's not just about land or political power. It's about the lives and the future of millions of people.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so critical to understand all the different angles of the situation. It's not a clear-cut conflict, but this complicated mix of competing interests, historical baggage, and human struggles.
We've talked about some of the possible ways towards peace, but it's clear that the road ahead is going to be really bumpy. The conflicting goals of all the major players, the politics inside the U.S., and the uncertain role of Europe, all of that makes for a very volatile and unpredictable situation. Stay tuned, because in Part 3, we'll dive into the reactions from around the world and how these economic shockwaves are spreading outward from this conflict. All right, so we've been focused on the battlefield and the negotiations, but now it's time to zoom out and see how the rest of the world is watching all of this unfold. Because let's face it, a conflict like this, it doesn't stay neatly contained within borders. The impacts are felt everywhere, from global alliances to, even the price of goods.
It's true. It's like when you drop a pebble in a pond, that first splash is just the start. Then you've got those ripples spreading out further and further, touching every part of the pond eventually.
Exactly, and in this case, that pond is our interconnected world. So let's start close to home. We talked about those reactions from U.S. lawmakers before, but our sources reveal some interesting nuances. It's not just a simple Democrats versus Republicans kind of thing. There's more to unpack here.
Yeah, peeling back those layers is where it gets really interesting. On the surface, you see Democrats expressing outrage, accusing President Trump of putting Ukraine's security at risk, and maybe even breaking the law by freezing that aid package that Congress had approved.
I mean, that was a bold move, even for Trump.
It was. And their anger comes from this belief that he's basically giving Russia an advantage by weakening Ukraine. But then on the Republican side, it's not so straightforward. Some of them are echoing those concerns, genuinely worried about what this all means for global stability.
Yeah, it's like that with foreign policy, rarely a simple black and white situation.
Right. And then you've got other Republicans who are totally on board with Trump's strategy, saying it's high time Europe starts pulling its weight when it comes to defense. Their argument is that the U.S. has been shouldering the burden, both financially and militarily, for way too long.
So this is about more than just the conflict itself. It's about changing the balance of power globally.
Absolutely. And speaking of global players, let's talk about China for a second. They haven't exactly been quiet about their disapproval of how the U.S. has been handling things, especially on trade. Remember that statement from the Chinese embassy? It got a lot of attention.
Oh, yeah, they definitely didn't hold back.
Right. And those trade tensions have real-world consequences. We're seeing car manufacturers who are so reliant on those global supply chains, they're starting to get really nervous about a potential trade war.
Because if things keep escalating, those supply chains could get disrupted. And that would mean higher prices, maybe even shortages.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how interconnected everything is, economics and geopolitics. While we're seeing this conflict play out in Ukraine, the economic ripples are being felt across the entire world.
That's that butterfly effect, right? One event, seemingly isolated, can set off a chain reaction that impacts everything.
It really is. And that's why understanding the nuances of all this is so crucial.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about who wins or loses a battle. It's about navigating this constantly shifting landscape where every decision can have really big consequences.
So we've gone from the streets of Kiev to the halls of power in Washington and beyond. We've explored the possibilities for peace agreements, the complex relationships between global alliances, and these economic shockwaves that are being felt worldwide.
And the fascinating thing is, we're really just scratching the surface. This is a situation that's evolving every single day, with new information and developments constantly emerging.
Which leads us to the most important question. What does all of this mean for you, the listener? How can you make sense of all this complexity and use that understanding to make informed decisions in your own life?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. It's crucial to not just take in information at face value. You have to dig deeper, question assumptions, consider different perspectives. The world is rarely black and white, and understanding those nuances, that's the key to navigating these complicated times.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed with so much information coming from all directions, But I hope this deep dive has given you some tools to start making sense of it all. Remember, staying informed is that first step towards making a difference.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and if you're feeling generous, consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find that link down in the description. Your support means a lot, and it helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the biggest issues we're all facing today.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep with us.